The Center for Mind, Brain, and Culture is delighted to welcome Dr. Kenneth Carter. Dr. Carter received his PhD from the University of Michigan, and after completion of his doctoral work, he also earned an MS in psychopharmacology from Fairleigh Dickinson University. He's currently the Charles Howard Candler Professor of Psychology at Oxford College of Emory University. And I should mention that Dr. Carter was also an undergraduate at Emory and at Oxford. So this is full circle, I guess. Before joining the Oxford College faculty, Dr. Carter served as a senior assistant research scientist, the Centers of Disease for Disease Control and Prevention's prestigious epidemic, sorry, can't read apparently, intelligence service with a research focus on smoking as a risk marker for suicidal behaviors in adolescents. At Oxford, his scholarship is concerned with psychopharmacology and psychopathology. He teaches introductory courses in psychology as well as advanced courses in clinical psychopharmacology, research methods, and personality. Dr. Carter has published extensively in both academic and lay publications and actively engages in the translation of research in psychology into everyday language. His articles have been published in a variety of different outlets, including magazines such as Mental Floss, and he has appeared on numerous news programs with both kids and adults. He's the co-author of Learn Psychology, a textbook now in its second edition, and he's currently at work on an introductory psychology textbook. Is it done yet? Close?
I'm actually relaunching it with a different publisher. Yeah,
Oh, cool.
I'm working
Okay.
on a psychopathology textbook. Yeah.
Yes, and a psychopathology textbook for Cambridge University Press. So busy. But his most recent book is Buzz, Inside the Minds of Thrill Seekers, Daredevils, and Adrenaline Junkies. And that's a Cambridge University Press publication. So that's just a sort of a whirlwind tour of Dr. Carter's career. We're so excited to have you here today, Ken. And the title of Ken's talk today is The Psychology of Thrill Seekers. So join me in welcoming Dr. Carter.
Great, thank you so much. And I did scroll through really quickly to see some people here, and I have to say hello to Marshall Duke. You're an inspiration to me. I remember taking your psychopathology class when I was an undergraduate. And I think it was at 8 a.m. and that really sort of guided me in my work. So thank you so much for all you've done for psychology and for me too, especially. Okay, so let me go ahead and share my slides and tell you a little bit about my work on the psychology of thrill seeking. So give me just 1 second to do this correctly the first time. So I want to sort of start off by telling you that this is actually not the book I wanted to write. So working on this book about the thrill seekers is sort of came on almost by mistake, actually. So I prepared a bunch of things to share with you. I can go over a bunch of it or some of it, but I'm also really excited to sort of answer the questions you might have. So let me tell you a little bit about why this wasn't the book I intended to write and a little bit about the psychology of thrill seeking. We all know people that I would call chaos junkies, people who are sort of drawn to chaotic experiences. And the first idea I had for this book was called The Chaos Junkie's Guide to Life. And it was supposed to be a book about how not to be chaotic, because I'm not very chaotic. And I thought maybe people like my clients and my students would enjoy a guide to how to be less chaotic. So I started diving into the research and I stumbled across the work of Zuckerman on sensation seeking, and it actually took me into that area. But what we found out was that people who are these sort of high sensation seeking personalities, and I'll tell you a lot about them in a moment, have different reactions to chaotic events. And I'm going to show you an example of one. And I want you to sort of think about whether or not you're sort of more like Megan or more like her friend. And I will warn you in this video, it's kind of loud at points. And so if you have your audio turned up, you might want to turn it down just a little bit because there is a little bit of screaming. So here is Megan and her friend getting ready to do a roller coaster ride.
We go now? Wait, what? Oh my God! Oh my god! Oh my god, no, 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 no! Oh my god! Oh my god! No, my heart! Oh my god, no!
Fine.
Oh my god, I'm fucking freaking out. Do we know when we're gonna go?
That goes on for a little bit longer, but that was enough to give you an example. It's pretty clear that Megan was not excited about that situation, but her friend was having a really great time. So I was really sort of drawn to why people are sort of drawn to chaotic experiences and enjoy them, and other people get really freaked out like Megan. And we think about these people as thrill seekers. And when you think of a thrill seeker, you think of a guy like this. This guy's name is Mark. He's actually one of the first people I ever interviewed for my book. And he is definitely someone that you would call a thrill seeker. And I was fascinated by what draws them to these situations and not to sort of break down emotionally when it happens. And interestingly, Mark is a math teacher, and now he's actually given up that job and sort of travels the world. In fact, I can't even look at that video. Anyway, so when you think of the history of sensation seeking or thrill seeking, it's kind of not what you'd expect. The history of sensation seeking started off with research on sensory deprivation. They put people into these sort of sensory deprivation experiences, and what they discovered was that some people could stay there for hours and they were perfectly fine, and others couldn't stand it for a couple of moments. But Zuckerman couldn't really predict who might behave in which way. So he ended up abandoning his research on sensory deprivation and dived into the research on sensation seeking. And this is how he defines it. Sensation seeking is a trait that's defined by the seeking of varied, novel, and complex and intense sensations and experiences, and the willingness to take physical, social, legal, or even financial risks for those experiences. He came up with a sensation seeking survey. There's a new version of it that's a relatively short survey. In fact, it is so short, we can actually take it right now. So if you just have a piece of paper and you list number 1 through 8 and answer the following 8 questions, you can sort of figure out what your sensation seeking scores are for the 4 different components and the overall score. So go ahead and make a number 1 through 8. And for each of these statements, indicate which of the choices, sorry about the typo there, describes you best. Number 1 for not at all like me, 2, not like me, 3, unsure or both, 4, like me, or 5, very much like me. And there's only 8 questions. Question number 1, I would like to explore strange places. Go ahead and give yourself a 1 through 5 for that. Number 2, I get restless when I spend too much time at home. Now, this might be a little bit different these days, but in general, do you get restless when you spend too much time at home? Number 3, I like to do frightening things. Number 4, I like wild parties. Number 5, I would like to take off on a trip with no pre-planned routes or timetables. Number 6, I prefer friends who are excitingly unpredictable. Number 7, I would like to try things like bungee jumping. And last, number 8, I would love to have new and exciting experiences, even if they are illegal. So for those 8 questions, when you add up your total score, that gives you your total sensation seeking score. And there's 4 different subscales, which we'll talk about in a moment. Questions 1 and 2 added up are your experience seeking score. Questions 3 and 4 is your boredom susceptibility score. Questions 5 and 6 is your disinhibition score. And questions 7 and 8 is your thrill and adventure seeking score. And we're going to get to those in just a moment in terms of what they mean. I'll leave that up there for a second. So I mentioned before there are different components to sensation seeking. The first I want to talk about is called thrill and adventure seeking. These are people who are sort of drawn to dangerous activities. It could be roller coasters, driving fast, wingsuit flying. If you score high in thrill and adventure seeking, these are the things that you're sort of drawn to. Low scores are sort of not as drawn to those thrill and adventure seeking dangerous activities. But you might be a thrill seeker and not be drawn to those things because you might score high in experience seeking. Experience seeking is sensation seeking of the mind and of the senses. These are people who are drawn to unusual people, unusual travel, or even unusual foods that they may want to taste. And they'll taste the strangest things on the menu. The first two scales tell me a little bit about the kind of sensations you might want to try. The last two tell me how much trouble you might get yourself into with your sensation seeking. One's called disinhibition. This is your ability to be unrestrained. People that score low always look before they leap. People that score high, they just leap. In fact, you might decide that you would try something like in this video, this picture here, which is from Portland's pants off subway day. So people that was the day that people decide to ride the subway with no pants on. You would need to have a little bit of disinhibition to be involved in something like that. The last scale talks about boredom susceptibility. This is your ability to be how easy you get bored and how irritated you get when you get bored. Those that score low almost never get bored. Those that score high get bored really easily, and they get kind of crabby when they do. So through these different sensation seeking scales, you can actually figure out different types of sensation seekers that there might be. I used the long version for my book, and so I want to show you some different variations of different kinds of sensation seekers that took the questionnaire and wanted to share their story on my website. For example, this is Rachel. Rachel says, I avoid doing things that I feel completely out of my own control, but I love doing random and spontaneous things where I'm in charge. Hence, I hate flying commercially, and I have a fear of flying. Her thrill adventure seeking score is about 29, which is relatively high out of 40. Her thrill adventure seeking score is really low, 3 out of 10. So it's relatively low for being a high sensation seeker, but she's an experience seeker, scoring 8 out of 10 experience seeking. Disinhibition is 9, which means she probably will try things without thinking through them. And boredom susceptibility is 8, which means that most of her sensation seeking is around that experience seeking kind of thing. A little bit different than Alex. Alex says, my family has described me as suffering from pathological wanderlust and always seeking adventure. When I was younger, they jokingly sort of tried to take away my National Geographic Adventure and Traveler magazines because they gave me bad ideas. When I'm sick and in bed, I watch travel and adventure documentaries. I'm not very active on social media because I get too bored sitting at my computer. Still a pretty high sensation seeker at 35 out of 40. She scores high on both thrill and adventure seeking and on experience seeking, and high on disinhibition and boredom susceptibility. So she's likely to get bored and sort of try random things, which is probably why they want to take away her National Geographic magazines. It's a sort of continuum. Most people, of course, fall in the middle in terms of sensation seeking. Most of the people that I study are these high sensation seekers. I, on the other hand, have a relatively low sensation seeker. I scored about an 8 out of 40. So I'm about as low in sensation seeking as they get. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about where sensation seeking may come from. People ask me all the time, is it biological or environmental? And the answer is yes. I want to tell you a little bit about both the biological aspects as well as some of the environmental aspects. But before I do that, I want to tell you about a trip I took to Twin Falls. Maybe 6 or 7 years ago, I was doing a talk to a bunch of psychologists in Twin Falls. I'd never been there before, but I was expecting really nice people and maybe some potatoes. But what I discovered was something I was completely unprepared for. I was telling the group about my interest in thrill seeking, and they said, if you're interested in thrill seeking, you're going to want to go to the bridge. I had no idea what they were talking about. Why would I want to go to a bridge? But the bridge is the I.M. Perrine Bridge, which is the only bridge in North America where you can base jump from that bridge whenever you want to. And for me, as a low sensation seeker, whenever you want to would be never. But people actually travel and move to Twin Falls to be closer to the bridge. If you're not familiar with base jumping, it's an acronym that stands for the favorite jumping off spots of these individuals, bridge, antenna, span, or cliff. And when I went there, I met a group of people, including Nick. Nick actually moved to Twin Falls because he was interested in being closer to the bridge. And when I asked him what he loved about base jumping, he says that jumping forces you to be in the now, like nothing else matters, and you're focusing on what you're doing and just enjoying it. Now, before I show you this video of Nick, I want to let you know that he, again, I just ran into him and 4 other people who are getting ready to do this jump. In his backpack here is an old rescue parachute that he bought from a friend for 20 bucks, I think. And the parachute is apparently older than he is. And he was actually testing out this parachute for the very first time. And so I was nervous just standing on the bridge taking the video, but let's watch as Nick tests out his parachute for the very first time. So I will say that I have not watched a lot of people base jump from bridges before, but even I thought his chute opened up kind of a little bit late. And I will also say I've never felt so uncool before in my entire life. Each of the base jumpers decided to high five me before jumping off the bridge. And I was just nervous as the traffic was going by and they were just jumping off of the bridges. But Nick texted me after the jump and said, could you send me the video of my jump? I think my chute opened up a little bit late and I want to figure out what happened. So when I was talking to him, I said, so Nick, how did you feel as you were falling and you noticed that your chute hadn't opened yet? And here's what he said. So I'm watching the ground rush up and it's almost like an eerie, surreal feeling. In a way, you're really calm and taking it all in. You're like, this is what's happening. I'm along for the ride, you know? I didn't. I was like, Nick, I have no idea what you're talking about. But as I learned more about high sensation seekers, I realized that high sensation seekers have a different experience of the world than average and low sensation seekers. And I want to tell you a little bit about what it comes from. Some of these experiences can be explained by neurobiological environmental factors. And I want to show you, talk about one of those factors. We've all heard of cortisol. Cortisol is that A-list stress hormone. When cortisol is active, it helps adjust the body's systems to handle stress. It slows down digestion. Your heart starts to race. It revs up your muscles to get ready to fight things, increases blood pressure, and it gets us all ready to fight dangers, flee from them, or my favorite, freeze to avoid detection. There's another chemical that I want to mention here, which is called dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter that's associated with pleasure. It's sort of very abundant in the brain's reward center, and dopamine, as you understand, is associated with pleasure. So during highly chaotic experiences, high sensation seekers actually don't produce that much cortisol. They produce lower levels of cortisol than average and than low sensation seekers, but they actually produce more dopamine than average and low sensation seekers when they're in those highly chaotic experiences. So when they're in those potentially dangerous experiences, they don't set off the same kinds of chemical alarms. So they're not releasing the same kinds of stress hormones than an average or a low sensation seeker might. And this might explain why high sensation seeking individuals experience less stress, but more pleasure than their low sensation seeking friends when they're in those chaotic experiences. And this explains why they're drawn to unusual foods, or why they might not back down from a fight, or why they might be drawn to certain kinds of careers like first responders, or even other kinds of things. So what I want to do a little bit before in the next 15 minutes, and then I'll open it up for questions in about 20 minutes or so, is to talk about what I feel like I've learned from these thrill seekers. And I've learned a bunch from them. And there's 4 that I want to introduce you to. 3 of them are in the book. Will, Jeb, and Catherine, I sort of feature in the book. And there's one new one that I did an interview with, whose name is Faith Dickey. So Faith is a highliner, Will is an ice climber, Jeb Corliss is a wingsuit flyer, and Catherine Beatty is a wheelchair WBMX rider. So start off with Faith. She calls herself Slackline Girl. So if you Google Slackline Girl, you can watch videos of the things that she does. And for those of you who are not familiar with slacklines are these sort of narrow nylon strips about 2 inches wide, about the width of this part of a business card. And exactly no part of my foot is 2 inches wide, but she balances on these slack lines hundreds of feet above the ground. In fact, sometimes she's actually done it with no safety at all. And when I talked to her about why she does it, she says, sometimes you can't control things and you just have to sort of hang there. She talks about how doing these high sensation seeking activities helps her with her own emotional regulation. She says, if I can do it on the ground and walk along a narrow strip on the ground, why can't I do it 300 feet in the air? I should be able to regulate my own emotions. And so here's a little video of Faith sort of talking a little bit about what she does and why. And as a low sensation seeker that's often driven by my own cortisol, that's sometimes something I try to remember myself. The next person I want to mention is Will Gadd. Will's an ice climber who's actually one of the first people to climb up Niagara Falls. And from Will, I learned a little bit more about why sensation seekers do what they do. And he says, he's looking to do really difficult things and do them well. So here's a quote that from an interview I did with him. I think that most people think that when you're in my shoes, what we're looking for is a huge shot of adrenaline. We're not. A huge shot of adrenaline is a lousy drug. What I'm looking to do is really difficult things and do them well. That's what's challenging to me. That's what fires me up in life, whether it's putting together a big project and figuring out how to make it work or climbing well. It's solving puzzles and doing really interesting, cool things that are exciting and fun. That's what life's about. If I just wanted adrenaline, it would be a lot simpler. I would just go run back and forth across the highway. If that's what's making my mind tick, there's simpler ways to do it. Here's a quick little video of Will in his trip up Niagara Falls.
Game on in a minute or so here.
Copy that, Will. Be careful. Be safe.
Niagara Falls, yeah! How cool is that?
I became fascinated with like ice climbers and how much focus and concentration it takes, because you have to hit the ice in exactly the right place to know if it's going to hold you. And so being in that chaotic experience, but needing that focus is what the high sensation seeking personality sort of allows him to be able to do. Two more people I want to feature. One is Jeb Corliss. He's a wingsuit flyer. Now, every now and then, some people say that you should never say never, but this is in my category of things I will never do. He is a wingsuit flyer that actually was in an accident and broke many of the bones in his body and sort of degloved one of his legs in an accident when he hit the side of a mountain. In an interview, he was talking about how he just loved to do experiences that get him sort of out into the world. Here's my quote from the book. I love activities that force you to get off the couch and get out into the world and see new experiences in life. For me, that's really important. That's why I like surfing. That's why I like climbing. That's why I like skydiving. That's why I like base jumping. That's why I like scuba diving. All these activities have forced me to travel the world and meet new and unique, interesting people and cultures. He says, he compares sort of his motivation to the motivation of astronauts. They didn't go to the moon just to see how much adrenaline they could get. They had an incredibly difficult task. And their goal was to get to the moon and back in the safest way they possibly could. That's my goal now. I do select incredibly dangerous things to do, but my goal is to try to get there and back in the safest way I possibly can. Sometimes I succeed and sometimes I don't. And here is a video that he sent me that I could share with you of one of his wingsuit. And it is incredibly beautiful to watch. But to me, it's, as a low sensation seeker, probably never do it, but I'm excited that he can handle that much chaos.
Oh, Dad, oh, Dad, oh, Dad, won't you spare me over another But what is this that I can't see with ice cold hands taking hold of me? When God is gone and the devil takes hold, who'll have mercy on your soul, Dad?
And the last sensation seeker I want to mention and go into what I've learned from them is Catherine Beatty. And from her, I sort of learned the idea or how to apply the idea or concept of grit, the determination to keep trying. She said, if it's easy, I don't see the fun in it. And it's just less of a reward. It feels so much better when you can do something that's hard and finally land it. You might be able to do something very gracefully, but if it's easy, what's the fun in that? So I'm always looking for the next thing to do that's going to challenge me. Like I mentioned before, she's one of the very first people to do a backflip in a wheelchair, and she's a wheelchair BMX rider. And she was actually featured in a Science North exhibit that I worked with on the science of thrill seeking. So here's a quick little video of Catherine doing a backflip in a wheelchair.
Yeah, I have spastic quadriplegia cerebral palsy, which is mostly affects like really premature babies, and I was born 3 months premature.
Hey, I'm Catherine Beatty. I'm from La Cañada, California. I'm here at Woodward West. I'm about to backflip on my wheelchair.
A year ago, I came to Woodward West and hucked my first backflip into foam, and it didn't go so well. You know, it took, I think, 7 hours to get the full rotation into foam. Kept practicing, and kind of just stuck with it. And, you know, here I am today to get it to Resi, so hopefully it goes well.
So often we see people who are doing a sport and we sort of assume they just sort of go out and do it. We don't realize how much training and practice it can take. So what can we learn from thrill seekers? You might not do these things in your life, but what can you learn from them? And I've got a couple things that I feel like I've learned from this research. Number one, go with the flow. If you're familiar with the work of Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, if you're ever doing something and forget you're doing it, that's that concept of flow. It's being immersed and holding that energized focus, full involvement and enjoyment in life. We know the more that you're engaged in flow, the more creative you can be, the more satisfied with life, higher self-esteem. And high sensation seekers are the individuals who can fly and flow in climbing and adventure sports, or even adventure travel, where they're sort of out in the world doing things. But even though I'm not going to go and do a base dive or jump off of a cliff, or probably not even a backflip in a wheelchair, low sensation seekers can also find flow in their lives as well. I find flow in listening to music or reading or gardening, which is another, what I call a very expensive way to feed the squirrels, because everything I made was eaten this year. The other thing is to feel the awe. You know, high sensation seekers know what brings awe to them, and awe is that feeling of of wonder and astonishment. And it turns out we know that awe can be pretty good for you. There was a study in UC Berkeley several years ago where they had about 100 students that asked how they were, their frequency of experience different emotions. And what they found was that after sampling for interleukin-6, a molecule that's sort of linked to inflammation, that awe was the emotion most sort of correlated with the lowest levels of that of IL-6 was awe. And so we know that the best moments in our lives are not necessarily those passive, receptive, relaxing times, according to Csikszentmihalyi. The best moments usually occur in a person's body or mind is when they're stretched to the limits in a voluntary effort to accomplish something difficult and worthwhile. When we think about sensation seekers as being adrenaline junkies, but what they may be doing is really sort of chasing awe. Faith finds awe in standing on slack lines, hundreds of feet above the ground, sometimes in high heel shoes. I'm not going to find awe in that way. It would be overwhelming to this low sensation seeker. I find awe in things like this. I took a glacier tour in Alaska, and then just sort of looking out over the vastness can bring that sense of awe to me. A third thing I feel like I learned from sensation seekers is about trust and trusting yourself. For me, I feel like I always have a plan A, B, C, and D for everything. And one of my favorite studies that I tell my students about was a study about worry, where they gave a bunch of people to keep a worry log for a couple of weeks. They're supposed to write down everything that they were worried about. And then several weeks later, they followed up and they said, hey, here's a list of things that you said that you were worried about. Did these things happen? And how did you handle them? And they actually discovered that about 80% of the things that people were worried about never happened at all. And the ones that did happen, they actually handled them better than they thought they would. High sensation seekers don't tend to be like that. They tend to throw themselves into chaotic experiences and they feel convinced they can figure it out. Low sensation seekers like me, I tend to go through what I call recreational anxiety, where I worry about things that are probably not going to happen, and I solve problems that aren't going to happen 4 different times. And I feel like one of the things I learned from them is to sort of trust my ability to be able to do things. And that's an important thing as well. Another thing, the last I feel like I learned from the sensation seekers was there are worse things than having a bad experience. You know, I did an interview soon after my book came out on Georgia Tech Radio, and we were somehow the conversation turned to pig ear sandwiches. And I said, you know, that's definitely on my do not try list. And the host said, why not? Like, what's going to happen if the worst thing you can have is a bad experience? And so one of the things I realized from high sensation seekers is that they're more likely to put themselves in experiences that may not work out, but they may get some reward from it as well. And this is also especially around food. They actually did a study that found out that high sensation seekers have a less sort of, they get less sort of disgusted by disgusting or unusual foods. And low sensation seekers, if they try things they don't like, are more likely to feel like they're going to sort of throw up. And so there is a little bit of a physiological difference in terms of how we experience things. So I'm glad we got to this point because I wanted to show you a video that I did with my students around the time I was producing a Coursera course in psychology of thrill seeking, something I called the jelly bean experiment. This is a little bit long, it's about 3 minutes long, but I think you'll enjoy it. And and those of you who are, the results didn't turn out exactly like I expected. What I did was I got the students that we're going to try something you don't have to do if you don't want to, and I put them in a room, didn't tell them what was going to happen. And I gave them a sensation seeking questionnaire. on the bottom, you'll see their scores on 4 different components of sensation seeking and their total score. And then I gave them these Bernie Bott's every flavor beans, like every flavor, including disgusting flavors. And I wanted to find out whether or not sensation seeking was sort of linked with their willingness to try these different jelly beans. Didn't turn out like I expected, but I know why. And those of you who do any research method stuff should be able to figure out what went wrong in it. But it still was a really fun demonstration. So let me show you this, what I call the jelly bean challenge. Okay, I bet you're curious about what we're up to today. I've got some jelly beans here of different flavors. Some are delicious and some can be kind of disgusting. I've chosen a jelly bean for you. I will tell you what the possible flavors are, and then you can decide if you want to eat it or not. So take a look at your jelly bean. You don't have to eat it. Yours is either strawberry banana or barf. Do you want to try your jelly bean? You don't have to if you don't want to. Do you want to try it?
No, I'm okay.
Okay, you're okay. That's fine. Back in the cup. Okay. Your jelly bean, it's either juicy pear or booger.
You know what? I'm gonna eat it.
Okay.
Oh my god. What am I tasting right now?
Is it juicy pear?
It's not juicy pear. It's an interesting flavor though.
It's an interesting flavor. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Take a look at yours. That one is either chocolate pudding or canned dog food. Oh. Oh, chocolate, great. Yours is either buttered popcorn or rotten egg.
No, I'm good.
Okay. Okay. That's it. Thank you. Thank you. Yours is either strawberry banana or barf. You want to try it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Not strawberry banana.
Okay. Not sure you think it's barf?
It's like cat food.
Oh, kind of tastes like cat food.
But yeah, fine.
Yours is either juicy pear or booger. Do you want to try it? Pear. Okay, good, good. So yours is either chocolate pudding or canned dog food. Do you want to try it? Okay. You can spit it out if you want. Do you want to try the last one? It's either buttered popcorn or rotten egg.
Oh. Can't go over 2.
Yeah.
Is that rotten egg? We couldn't get Sean to stop eating them. And so at the very end, he grabbed a whole handful of them and just ate them all. I have no idea how he did it. But even if you don't, if you hate something, that's okay. It's one of the things I've heard from that I feel like I've learned from high sensation seekers. In fact, there's a guy in my book that I call Victor, and one of my favorite sort of interviews with him, and this is sort of what he said. He said, every time something new comes up, I think, oh, wouldn't that be a fantastic thing to add to my collection? Wouldn't that be a great other thing to go in that little museum I've got in my mind? Every time I learn about something new, I want to go out and try it. So I also ask myself, like, what do you want to add to the museum in your mind? And what maybe trying something sort of new, unusual, if it's not dangerous, having it not work out isn't the worst thing. So I'm going to sort of stop there for now and sort of open it up for some questions that you might have about some of the things I've done or about the psychology of thrill seeking.
Ken, do you mind doing, do you want to do your own, or do you want me to
Oh yeah, if you
help.
could, yeah, if you could help a little bit with that. I see some people have their hands raised. I see, oh my,
Yeah,
Erwin
let's
there.
start with Erwin.
Hi, Ken. That was a great talk.
Good to see you.
It's good to see you. I hope you're keeping well, as you seem to be. So a couple things. First, I'm right there with you. We could compare how low our sensation-seeking scores are. So I was frankly, I was a bit terrified. You know, is it a wing flyer? What is
The
that
wingsuit
called?
flyer, yes, yes.
I can't even say it, but I was terrified by even the music that was playing in the background. So that's where I'm at on the scale. But one of the things that I guess never occurred to me, even as we study this a bit in my lab, more so recently, is the challenge aspect, the meeting a challenge aspect. I have to say that it never occurred to me about sensation seeking and risk taking and the like. So thanks for highlighting that. But I do have a question in all this, which is, so, you know, I think what you've shown highlights all the positive sides of this, which is good because we often think, especially me maybe, of the negative sides. They come too readily to mind. But so then what explains, do you think, the difference in people, I'm presuming, you know, that we've seen here, who experience the positive side versus when it goes wrong? Like why do some people get into trouble, and for some of them persistent trouble and very severe trouble, who have these traits, versus people like you've shown, who, at least in what you've shown of them, you know, are really adaptive and are able to challenge themselves in positive ways.
I'm glad, thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, I think part of it was I really wanted to highlight some of the positive pieces of it because it's easy to sort of think about the negative parts. There's a chapter in my book that I call The Dark Side, when I do delve into some of those kinds of things. And you probably know just as much as I do that they're more likely to be drawn towards, different kinds of addictive substances, addictive behaviors, and they're less likely to back down from fights. In fact, there was this interesting study where they had people to pick who they want to have an interaction with, someone who would be very much like them or not like them. And a lot of high sensation seekers, like, I want to pick someone that I'm going to fight with because that's really stimulating for them. And so I think that part of it really has to do with this is sort of a piece of their personality, and there may be other kinds of things that may be involved in it. But I suspect it has something to do with their disinhibition and boredom susceptibility in terms of being drawn to some of those kinds of things. Because the ability to sort of step back and think, no, that's more dangerous than I think it is, no, this is going to get me into trouble, is something that people with high levels of disinhibition and boredom may not be able to sort of moderate or even tolerate that much. But
so you think maybe going more to the facet level and differentiating among the 5 different categories of sensation seeking would be important for maybe predicting good outcomes versus negative outcomes.
I do. I think that's going to be an important piece of it, especially that ability to tolerate boredom, which is something we've all had to do a little bit lately.
Yeah, great, thanks.
Thank you.
I'm hoping I'm getting these in order. I think maybe Zoom is helping me here. So apologies if I don't. There are lots of hands up. So Trisha?
Yeah, hi. I really liked your talk, so thank you so much. I thought it was really interesting. I had a question about the jelly bean challenge. I guess I was wondering did you give the students the jelly bean before or after giving them like the thrill seeking test to because I guess I was wondering do you think that if you gave them the test like before the jelly bean, then that might have biased their decision in some ways?
Yeah, you know what I think biased the decision was the group factor, the fact that they were all together. And so I think that was the biggest predictor. They took the questionnaire, but they didn't know what their scores were until much later. But I think that, it was almost like, ash line experiment is really what it ended up being like, where having other people around them influence whether or not they would try it or not, except for Sean, who just wanted to eat everything.
Thank you.
Natalia, I think you were next.
Yeah, I thank you again for your talk. It was wonderful. While I was listening, I was wondering about the aspect of virtual reality and how that may be affecting sensation seeking. Is the activation of cortisol and dopamine the same for virtual reality, or no, or not? Or do you have any?
That's a great question. I know that I've done some virtual reality work with some of my students when they're practicing talks to help with their anxiety. There's this really cool program where you can actually select the size of your audience and what you want the audience to look like. And so I actually program the audience to look like what my students look like when they're really tired to make it for people to practice. But I think that for a lot of high sensation seekers, what they want are authentic experiences. So they may not be as drawn to virtual reality as they would for more immersive experiences. In fact, one of the things we learned about travel from high sensation seekers is they want to be immersed into different cultures. I interviewed this woman who called herself the White Rabbit, and she wanted to travel for 300 days with no money, just couch surfing around the world, because she wanted to sort of experience what it's like to live in those environments. I think for like average or slightly low sensation seekers, virtual reality would be a nice way to sort of step into that. But my guess would be a lot of high sensation seekers would maybe bristle because what they want is that authentic experience.
Arbor?
Hey, thanks for your talk. So many of the characteristics that you highlighted throughout your presentation seem to be really intrapersonal. And I'm wondering how much interpersonal considerations may be at play, things like social currency or social signaling. I mean, oftentimes people who are skydiving or bungee jumping are recording these things so that they can show others. So how much of it is trying to show the world that, like, look what I can do?
There's actually a little section in my book where I talk about the influence of social media on it as well. But there are also some other really fascinating intrapersonal characteristics where high sensation seekers tend to have a little bit higher like intercultural competence than average and low sensation seekers, but they also tend to have lower levels of emotional intelligence, interestingly, because they're really sort of focused in on their own experiences and they assume that other people's experiences are like theirs. So put those things together, and when they're in very unusual, unique circumstances, they can really shine. But when they are around people that they're familiar with, they can sometimes sort of tune them out a little bit. But I do think a lot of the aspects of what they're doing may be reinforced by social media for sure.
And just one more question while I have you.
Yeah.
How much do you think we can learn from what we know about adolescence in trying to come up with a model of thrill seeking? Because it seems like, the adolescent brain and what we've learned over the past decade may serve as a nice vehicle of like trying to sketch this thing out. So in what ways do you see overlap? In what ways do you see unique characteristics that adolescents, for example, can't explain?
Yeah, adolescence is such a complex time, and even more so lately with social media. In fact, I've always wanted to do a study to find out from my students how many of their friends have they never actually met in person before. So trying to get that aspect of that is important. I know that sensation seeking peaks in early adolescence and tends to sort of slowly get lower as we get older, except for boredom susceptibility tends to remain relatively stable over time. We do see some changes in things like MAO levels and testosterone levels that may be influencing that, or even sort of social aspects, people that I call anchors, which sort of pull people back from doing very risky things when you have more to lose as you get older. Children, careers, and things that if you slip and fall on a slack line, the way that you predict how safe you're going to be is very different when you're younger than older. Thank you.
Shauna.
Thanks for the talk. Something I was hoping you could speak to is what are the potential relations between sensation seeking and negative emotionality? I studied psychopathy in the past, and I know that the relations between psychopathy and negative emotionality are pretty complex depending on the form of negative emotionality and the dimension of psychopathy. And I know sensation seeking is not the same as psychopathy, but they certainly overlap in many ways. So I'm curious what you found in terms of the negative emotionality side of things.
Yeah, there were a couple of studies that sort of looked into that a little bit, but not as many as I would hope. We also saw some positive things in terms of even leadership aspects of high sensation seekers, and whether or not they're more likely to do things because of the outcome, but also their ability to predict how much trouble they're going to get into, and whether or not they're willing to do things to get, whether or not that trouble makes a difference in terms of their choices is going to be a little bit, it will be influenced by their sensation seeking. So their bodies aren't reacting as if things are dangerous in some ways. And so I can definitely see some of the overlap, but there's not as much out there as I was hoping in that area.
Yeah, I'm curious with things like, anhedonia or depression, being like really bored or almost having to work harder to experience awe than, lower sensation seeking individuals. So I'm
not
curious
necessarily
what that might look like.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry. It's not necessarily working
No, I was
harder.
finished.
For a lot of them, it's just getting in a car and driving really fast, right? And so that can be influenced by their socioeconomic levels, right? So people who can afford wingsuit flying and bungee jumping are going to do more of those elaborate things. People that don't necessarily have access to those things are going to do things like picking fights with other people, not backing down from fights, and driving really fast. And so they end up sort of putting themselves into greater risk for negative consequences if they can't afford to do sort of fancy kind of high sensation seeking stuff.
I think we have time for a few more questions, Dietz.
Yeah, thank you. I had a question that's maybe pretty basic, but when you were talking about dopamine and cortisol, and you said, well, maybe this explains why people are acting differently and experiencing things differently. And I think it's a natural tendency to think about the biological level there as sort of causative, but I'm wondering, do we actually know that it's like maybe their dopamine is lower because their attitudes are different, or maybe their cortisol is lower because of something cognitive about risk prediction? What do we know about sort of the direction of causality, and and there's also an assumption that if it is driven by a neuroendocrine response, and maybe that has a genetic basis and you're born that way, or is it experience? So at all levels, where do the causal arrows go?
Yeah, that's why I always say yes to everything. Yeah. And so we do know that there are some chemicals that are associated with sensation seeking as it changes over time, or even in certain careers. They did some studies with MAO levels that tend to influence some aspects of sensation seeking in bullfighters, finding out that the MAO levels for people in certain kinds of careers that are more associated with high sensation seeking may be higher. They've done some twin studies with sensation seeking, looking at what they think the correlation might be, and they suggest it may be about 60 to 70% may be explained by some biological factors. I know they've done some studies looking at specific levels of cortisol before and then during certain chaotic activities. But again, it's hard to know like what's driving what in certain areas. We do know that high sensation seekers habituate much more quickly than average and low sensation seekers. So that habituation to those wingsuit flying or bungee jumping or bullfighting may be faster, which may sort of result in lower levels of cortisol. So you're right, there's a whole bunch of different things that can be combined together.
If you're game, can we still have some questions?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Tom?
Yeah, thanks for the really interesting talk. I have two. We'll see how quick the first one is, and then if it's long, we can not do the second one. But I was sort of thinking about how sensation seeking might be really good in small amounts in groups, but that there's sort of like a Goldilocks area where like too little or not enough is probably pretty maladaptive. And I was wondering, I mean, there's like, I think some interesting maybe evolutionary implications for that, but I was wondering if you or anyone has looked at sort of how this applies to group dynamics and the success of groups and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think the most successful groups would have like not that many people like me in it. The low sensation seekers. We sort of need a balance of those individuals who are going to be risky and be able to sort of move things ahead versus average low sensation seekers like me that I know that everything seems dangerous to me. So there was this guy who contacted me because I think one of his professors wanted him to talk to me because he was going to sea kayak around Iceland, and he wanted me to let him know if I thought this was a good idea. And my answer is, I think everything's a bad idea. I'm the wrong person to talk to about this. And so you need some people who can sort of look at that sort of risk versus reward and balance it out. High sensation seekers may sort of ignore the risks and go for the reward. People like me are going to see that danger lurking in all sorts of places.
Thanks. I'll let someone else ask it. Yeah.
Melissa?
Thank you for your talk. I'm a grad student now, but I went to undergraduate at Emory too. And the only reason part of me wish I went to Oxford was because I thought your classes sounded really cool. But Marshall Duke got me into psychology, so it worked out okay. I was wondering if I'm guessing that there would generally be a negative association between anxiety and sensation seeking. And I was wondering if there were any examples of people that you had talked to that even had generalized anxiety disorder and were these thrill seeking people as well.
Great question. And you're absolutely right. So sensation seeking tends to be protective against anxiety disorders. They have lower levels of anxiety disorders in general, particularly in PTSD. They've done studies looking at people who are exposed to traumatic experiences, and the people with higher levels of sensation seeking ended up being less likely to be diagnosed with PTSD. And wait, there's a second part. Oh, except for, I'm sure you may be familiar with the concept of a highly sensitive people. So there are some individuals, these are the sort of tortured individuals who are both highly sensitive individuals and high sensation seekers, which means they are drawn to these things, but they also sort of acknowledge that they're really dangerous. And so they're always sort of second guessing the fact that they love doing these things. And so I did interview a couple of them that are sort of torture themselves with their own sensation-seeking personalities. I wasn't able to find a great spot for it in the book, but there are definitely people out there. In fact, Elaine Aronson, someone actually wrote a little article about them. So if you email me, I can connect you up with that article about those individuals. I'm happy to do that.
Well, can we have 3 more questions? Are you okay with
Sure,
that?
I'm set for that. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Andy.
Hey, Ken, that was such a great talk. I thoroughly enjoyed every minute of it. And I myself score a 33, went skydiving this past summer, over Christmas break, I mean, and I have a very interesting childhood history where I grew up on a bear stream in Alaska on fishing lodges, and I had many, many near-death experiences. And my wife is always surprised that, I keep, she keeps telling me that's not a normal childhood. But for me, it was just getting chased by bears and on and on and on. And I'm wondering how much of this is an anchor point that gets set. For me, I got no rush out of the skydiving even. It wasn't I was expecting a huge adrenaline rush because I've seen videos of people doing it. And when I was doing it, it just felt wow, this is really fun and enjoyable. And I want to do it again. But I didn't get this adrenaline dump that I thought I was gonna get. And so how much of this is those early life experiences setting an anchor, and then things just don't seem as, thrilling later on in life?
Yeah, and so my assumption is that if you're a high sensation seeker and you're not sort of gushing cortisol and adrenaline, it's because you're able to sort of take in those experiences in a different way, like me, who would be sort of overwhelmed by those chaotic experiences. To me, there's a difference between sort of someone that may have had a traumatic experience and having some high sensation seeking kinds of kinds of things that they do, because we know that PTSD, one of the symptoms of PTSD is sort of risk-taking behavior, but that would sort of pop up in relationships with the PTSD. So it's as opposed to being a part of a personality trait. A lot of high sensation seekers do describe sort of chaotic childhoods, but it may be that they were chaotic because they were high sensation seekers and they were doing things that sort of that were chaotic.
That's true. I was hanging out on bear streams for fun. So
yeah. And so my guess is like, if someone told me that there bears come around here, I would leave, right?
Yeah,
and
I put myself in that position. You're right. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the fact that you could tolerate that may have been related to those early experiences that you had. That's sort of another way of thinking about it.
Yeah, super interesting. Thanks.
Christopher?
Just buy your book, by the way.
Sorry. Christopher?
Oh yeah, so I guess I also had a kind of developmental question as well. I'm just curious if in any of the people that you've spoken with or featured in this book, if they've had maybe forays into more antisocial sort of behaviors, or were they just kind of all since the age of 4 kind of on track to getting a Red Bull sponsorship? I mean, do you see that there's kind of some variation in sort of the progression towards these things, or I guess in terms of like more pro-social versus antisocial?
Yeah, and so I sort of made a decision when I was sort of crafting the book to sort of feature some of the more positive sides, because when it gets dark, it goes like really dark for a lot of the high sensation seekers. I did tell a story of a woman who said that she was convinced that her ex-husband was a high sensation seeker, and talked about a trip that they took on an airplane, where it was like a little tiny airplane, and he stalled it over the ocean and tried to get her to pull it out of the fall. And that he thought it was funny because like he knew that they weren't in any danger, right? But she was completely terrified. And when they were in cars and he would go back and out of traffic, assuming that other people sense the world like they do. And I think that is sort of the place where it can get really dark and tough for a lot of these high sensation seekers in terms of that emotional intelligence piece, but also not backing down from fights and those kinds of things that can cause lots of chaos in their lives. But I do get into that for sure, yeah. But in fact, there are a lot of stories like that, absolutely.
Chris? The other Chris?
So my question's a bit historical. Sorry, it took a second to unmute myself. It's a bit historical and maybe slightly weird, but whenever you study Freud, when you're studying the history of psychology, you learn about Thanatos, or the Thanatos drive, the drive for death or destruction. And I'm not sure what research has been done on that, if any, but it does seem like there's some connection in the sense that maybe there's this unconscious desire to bring yourself pretty close to death. Is there any way to do some kind of projective test to see if something like that's going on?
It was interesting because before I started on this, I would post on Facebook and on Twitter, I'm interviewing these high sensation seekers. What do you want me to ask them? The number one question everybody wanted to ask was, do you have a death wish? And so that's a question I asked almost everyone I talked to. And they were really, so I can tell you their response to it, which is not necessarily a projective response, but they said that, I get asked that a lot. They said they feel really misunderstood as high sensation seekers. And they said that this helps them feel really alive, that they don't perceive that they know that the things they're doing are dangerous, but they don't feel like they're in danger. They trust themselves. I talked to one guy, he said, so if I'm getting ready to do something in another city or a job, I won't do something where I might break an arm. And I'm like, wait, I never do things that might cause me to break an arm. I don't have like piles of things like, oh, I won't do these things next week. But they said, this one woman said, I'm not made out of glass. In order to have these experiences, I'm willing to do these risky things because the only way I can have these experiences is to do them. And so they say they don't have a death wish. They say that the kinds of things they do help them with emotional regulation when they're not doing those things. But it'd be interesting to figure out a way to do it in a productive way to sort of look at those differences in Thanatos for sure.
Thanks.
And then this really is the last question, Ken. It's always like there's 2 more questions, right?
I love questions.
Over the next hill. Hillary? Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, this was so interesting. Thank you so much for presenting this material. I was a little curious at the use of the term chaotic, right? Because it seems like certainly for some people who are maybe high on the disinhibition component, and for some of the people you described, things really are all over the place. They just got to find something exciting to do all the time. But on the other hand, for a lot of these things that people do, and for a lot of the individual stories you told, these people seem very deliberate. They're hyper planners. They, like the idea of only doing something dangerous when you know you can get to a hospital. So can you talk a little bit about the idea of chaos in all of this, and also whether there's a sort of chaotic subtype and there is an almost over planning subtype as well?
Thank you. And I think the term chaos sort of came from my perspective of what it might be like, because to me, being sort of overstimulated sort of creates that sort of sense of chaos. But for them, you're right, there's a sense of hyper-focus, time slows down, and they are able to do things when lots of things are going on. I talked to one woman who was in the astronaut training program for the Canadian Space Agency, and she was on one of those like fishing boats, like from The Greatest Catch, talking about how she did research in those environments. And what I guess what I mean by chaos from my perspective is, to me, when there's more than one thing going on, it feels like chaos. But for them, they can be very focused despite what else might be going on. But there may be different categories, especially when you add in those ideas of boredom susceptibility and you add in those ideas of disinhibition for sure.
Well, thank you, Ken. This was fantastic. We really appreciate. And you stayed for all these questions.
And thank you for letting me not talk about marijuana on 420 at 420.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everybody.